Welcome back, everybody. In this lesson we are going to look again at the USA making a superpower module, and we're going to be talking about another exam question, this time focusing on the other end of the specification, looking towards the latter period of the history that we examine in this module. And we're going to be focusing on the war in Vietnam. That's why we've got a particularly not the nicest of images in the world for our presentation. Although this isn't the worst image I could have picked for the war in Vietnam, so let's just count our lucky stars there. So the question that we're going to look at here is as follows. It's asking us again to examine a quote. The quote is, the US involvement in Vietnam caused significant political tensions in the USA between 1954 and 1972, and it's asking us to assess the validity of this view. Now, this is, in my opinion, a relatively difficult question. Not necessarily because of the amount of evidence that we can use to suggest that the involvement in Vietnam did cause significant political tensions, because we have plenty of evidence to show that. I think for the most part, even if we were to ask people colloquially what they know about the conflict in Vietnam, they would tell you that they would say that it caused political tensions in the USA, because it did. The difficulty comes from trying to argue the counterpoint to this statement, trying to argue either that it did not cause significant political tensions, or maybe arguing that it did cause political tensions, but nowhere near the kind of political tensions that, for example, other factors caused in the USA. You can make that claim if you want to, but you also do have to address the fact and address the argument as to whether or not Vietnam specifically caused and didn't cause political tensions in the USA. So I've tried my best to try and work out how we can best split this essay up and the kind of evidence that we can use. Again, like with all of the exam questions that I've been doing for these last few weeks now, the point isn't to regurgitate all of the specific information that you need for this particular question. The point is to focus on exam technique and only pick out certain bits of information that is relevant to what I'm talking about. So for the most part, we're going to be focusing on the arguments that to be made and the structure of the essay as you write it, not necessarily all of the specific detail that you can raise. So let's talk about the situation in Vietnam, and I think we can split the situation in Vietnam, and you can sort of go a little bit back and forth in a bit of a debate as to when the US involvement in Vietnam caused significant political tensions in the USA, because you could arguably make the claim that initially, early on, at least between 1954 and maybe up to 1960, for example, the US involvement in Vietnam did not cause significant political tensions in the USA. It was only after a certain period of time in Vietnam that we see these significant political tensions come about. So you can make the claim that initially, when the war in Vietnam was just ramping up, and don't forget, for those who have maybe a little bit more detailed understanding of the conflict in Vietnam, the conflict in Vietnam didn't just happen overnight like some conflicts in the 20th century did. Like, for example, it wasn't anything like the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany on a specific day, that being September the 1st, 1939, and then that started a war. Instead, it sort of ramped up quite slowly. Of course, there are very key points during this conflict where we see significant ramping up of the conflict and the significant ramping up of US involvement in Vietnam. For example, things like the Gulf of Tonkin incident specifically. But we still had involvement in Vietnam even before then. We had interest. The US, had interest in Vietnam as early as the presidency of Eisenhower. So we can see that the ramping up of the involvement in Vietnam was something that took place over a period of time. And initially, it was seen relatively positively. The idea of opting for a foreign policy of containment of communism, a containment policy, was relatively successful, or at least wasn't as controversial in the 1950s conflict in Korea, the Korean War. And this idea of containment of communism was something that spread into the idea of having a greater interest in Vietnam. However, what you can make clear is that as things continue to ramp up and as the years continue to pass within the conflict in Vietnam, people became a lot more disillusioned with this conflict. It became very clear that the US was not winning this conflict by any stretch of the imagination. And while they may have been a lot of support and a lot of political support for the US involvement in Vietnam initially, this support would decrease significantly. And we can pinpoint and highlight specific reasons for this. We can talk about, for example, the involvement of the media, of mass media within this coverage of the Vietnam War. You can make those points as long as you don't spend too much time focusing on those points. You can just talk about as these are the reasons why political tensions began to ramp up. The way in which people viewed the Vietnam War began to change, and mass media, for example, was one of the reasons. And we also have, of course, actual things within the military history of the Vietnam War that took place as well. For example, the Viet Cong launching a surprise counterattack in 1968, this being, of course, the Tet Offensive, that ultimately, while ending in failure, led to the communist Viet Cong controlling up to, at one point, 75% of South Vietnam, showing how significant the opponents were effectively against the United States in this conflict, showing the world that the United States had very little control over the conflict in this region. We also see that in 1972, the realities of certain weapons that are being used in the Vietnam War become increasingly clear. One of these main ones, of course, being napalm, and then we also have Agent Orange as well. And there's obviously very famous images of burned children running away from explosions. It's a very, very famous image that I was gonna use for this, but I decided I wouldn't. I'd instead just use a more generic image. Similarly, we also see with an increase in the failures of the USA in the Vietnam conflict, we see an increase in war crimes being committed, the most egregious of which being the March 1968 My Lai massacre of around 340 or so Vietnamese villagers who were allegedly, in very inverted commas, supporting or harboring communist fugitives. So it was clear, I think it's clear that you can ultimately conclude, and you should ultimately conclude to some extent, that the US involvement in Vietnam caused significant political tensions, okay? It became a very difficult issue for politicians to resolve, from Johnson to Nixon to Ford. We see that the involvement in Vietnam is something that becomes a problem. It becomes a question that has to be answered, okay? But again, you can make the claim that at least initially, at least in the early stages of this particular period, there were not as significant political tensions at all. And in fact, during this period between 1954 and 1972, there could have been other political tensions that were more significant than the involvement of the United States in Vietnam. Now, you should know about all of these different things. There's plenty of evidence you can argue for other factors that contributed to significant political tensions during this period. For example, you've obviously got the Nixon-Watergate scandal, and then especially you can talk about the decision by President Ford to pardon Nixon in September 1974. I know that's slightly out of the period that is stated in this question. This goes up to 1972, but obviously you can reference the pardoning of Nixon in 1974 as something that obviously is a continuing act that takes place, and the whole Watergate affair is something that you can talk about, at least that's the very latter part of this period. You can also talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Of course, this was a very significant foreign policy decision that was taking place under Kennedy and Khrushchev. And then another one that there is plenty of evidence for is, of course, the political tensions that took place as a result of the growing civil rights movement from the early 1950s all the way up to 1972 as well. And there's obviously plenty of evidence that you can use for that. You can use talk about the Civil Rights Act 1964, the Voting Rights Act 1965, the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka Supreme Court decision, the outcome of that and the subsequent protest that took place at the Little Rock High School, which led to Eisenhower being forced to actually call in the National Guard, well, I believe the National Guard, to actually help these children actually finally get into the school that they were constitutionally allowed to be in. There was the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. We obviously have the Supreme Court ruling that segregation was unconstitutional in 1956. We have the Freedom Rides organised in the 1960s. We have the 1965 March from Selma. All of these different things caused significant political tensions as well. And ultimately, they're all interlinked because we have these other factors as well. And you can make the argument, if you wanted to, that these cause more significant political tensions than involvement in Vietnam. And that's okay, you can spend time doing that, but it's important that you spend time talking about the impact of the Vietnam War and the impact of the Vietnam War on political tensions in the United States. You could also make a sort of tangentially related points and talk about the expansion of the Vietnam War by Nixon into Cambodia and Laos. This took place in May 1970 and culminated, it ended with the bombing of Cambodia and Laos, which was something that was a politically unpopular move, and it culminated in a communist revolt in Cambodia led by the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge, for those who don't know, was a regime that subsequently committed one of the worst genocides in human history in Cambodia. So we know that obviously the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia and Laos was a very disastrous idea by Nixon. So there are lots of points that you can talk about for this question, okay? And as long as you spend a significant amount of time talking about the Vietnam War, it's not necessarily a bad thing to then bring in some other points, to bring in some other arguments and talk about other political tensions in the USA between 1954 and 1972, other factors that caused more significant political tensions in the USA during this period. And that's how you can best answer this question, in my opinion.